Welcome to Book Club. I'm really into fun facts. Julie has an endless array of pop culture knowledge. Overall, I would say I liked it.
Something about the way she writes is like really concrete and immediate. Who is this man? Why is he in this costume? Like, why did he drop a squid? Like, you teased some juicy deets about the creation of this book.
This is, again, what Victoria finds interesting, not what is actually most important about these people.
What stories are we going to tell ourselves about this year?
Welcome to the party.
Welcome, guys.
Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia.
And Victoria.
We are two lifelong friends who read a book and talk about it each episode.
This is a podcast where we explore new perspectives and use books as a tool for personal and community growth.
This week we are reading Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu, and there will definitely be spoilers. So if you're a person who cares about that, we'll be talking about the entire book. If you don't want to hear about it before you read it, this is your official warning.
And if you don't care about spoilers at all, you're welcome to listen in even if you haven't read it.
Yeah.
We're really excited to talk about this book. It was suggested by our book club member Claire. Shout out to Claire.
Shout out Claire.
As a listener, if you want to help us select books for future episodes, you can become a member for only $3 a month at buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. Shameless plug for that. So thank you, Claire, for your support in recommending this book that we're really excited to talk about. I hadn't heard of Interior Chinatown or Charles Yu before reading this, though I guess I was familiar with some of his other work and just didn't know it was him. What about you, Julia? What was your experience with this book?
Yeah, I mean, if you've spent any amount of time in the Currently Obsessed section of our podcast, you'll know how much television I watch. So I loved this book. I thought it was very, very funny. I laughed out loud a lot. I made so many notes in the margins. I was like, oh my gosh, this is a reference to this thing, and this is a reference to this thing, and this is how they write this. And I was geeking out about it. My brother also studied screenwriting, and I have friends who work in the industry. I'm very familiar with how TV gets made. It's a very California thing for me to say. I have friends who work in the industry. But I do. I have a few. In very, casting, acting, writing, directing, etc. So yes. So I'm very familiar with that whole world. And so I really enjoyed this. And I loved the satire, and I thought it was really funny. And I thought the satire worked really well, except for the thing that really took me out of the story was the sort of climactic moment where Willis and older brother have these long courtroom monologues, which we'll get into it. The book is sort of mimicking an episode of Law and Order, so they do have long courtroom monologues. That's part of the setup, but the way that he did it in the book, really, it felt like I was seeing too much of the author's hand, and it just really took me out of it. And anyway, so I was a little disappointed by that, but then I loved how it ended, and so I was like, I can forgive 2 pages that I don't like for, a book that was really fun. But I know you had a different experience than I did.
So I will say most of the nuanced references probably went completely over my head. I got the Law and Order bit. That one, yeah. I was like, I am familiar with this one, but I don't watch as much TV. I'm not as familiar with screenwriting or TV making in general. But I did enjoy it. It took me a little bit to get into. I think it was just the very different form. Also, I was nitpicky. I went to Julia right when I started reading. I'm like, I don't like the font. The font bugs me, which he uses they printed it with the font of like a script would use, like a television script. I don't know what you call that font.
Courier 12 is the standard screenplay font.
Yes, there's it's all in Courier 12. And my brain was like, we don't like. Go away, Courier 12. But anyways, that's besides the point. Once I got into it, I did really appreciate what the book was doing. I agree, the monologues in the courtroom definitely felt pretty heavy-handed, especially because the rest of the novel wasn't. It wasn't.
Right.
It was really stand out, those monologues. And perhaps that was completely intentional, to have them be kind of over the top heavy-handed of like, this is what I'm doing here. But yeah, I think there could have been another way to do that. But that's, again, nitpicking, and otherwise really phenomenal book. And as we've gone into a very highly acclaimed book, we are not the only people who thought this was a really good one.
Yeah, although part of me with that, because I'm like, I don't know if your average person would love this book, but I feel like he really played to his audience in a way of like, I know the people who review books are not technically television writers, you know, they're book people specifically, but they're writers. And this is very much like a book for screenwriters in particular. And so I'm like, did he win a bunch of awards because the people who give awards really like this kind of book?
Yeah, it's like when there's a movie that wins an Oscar about making a movie.
Right. Yeah.
They're like,
yeah.
oh, this is so relatable. And then like the
Yeah.
99% of America that doesn't work in television and movie making is like, actually, I don't relate to, you know, being so famous and then having to
well, like
back
Birdman.
down.
Like almost no one saw Birdman, but all the Oscar people loved it because they were like, wow, it's so true. And you're just like, but I mean, I guess.
Would not surprise anyone, but I have not seen that movie, considering I watched like 3 films ever.
Not many people did.
That's besides the point. Let's talk about Charles Yu.
Yeah. Tell us more.
So, Charles Yu is an American author and TV writer producer. He was born in, I believe, Los Angeles, born in California to parents who are immigrants from Taiwan. He has a brother, fun fact. His brother is Kelvin Yu. You might know him as Brian Yang on Master of None.
What?
His brother is also the executive producer, writer of Bob's Burgers. So I don't know if Kelvin is older than Charles, but when I found out that about Kelvin Yu, I felt like it gave me a different light to think about older brother as the character.
Yeah.
But
that's interesting.
Charles does not have anything to be ashamed of. He has a very prolific career as well, doing multiple things. So he went to UC Berkeley for his undergrad and got a degree in biology and a minor in creative writing. So he was interested in writing from an early point. One interview he said that he was really into poetry when he was his undergrad, though obviously that's not necessarily what he's writing now. But he did kind of take a different path for a while. He went to Columbia Law School and spent 13 years in corporate law before going full-time with writing. Like, he started writing while he was working in law, but shifted gears completely. His TV credits now include being a story editor and writer for Westworld. He is writer and co-producer of Legion, and also the producer of Sorry for Your Loss. Interior Chinatown is his 4th book, his 2nd novel. He wrote 2 collections of short stories as well. And this was a finalist and winner for the National Book Award, and also was a finalist for this French award that I will not pronounce. We'll put it in the show notes because I don't speak French.
I want to try it. I've never seen this before, so I'm going off the cuff. Le Prix Médicis Étrangers.
That sounds wonderful. I don't speak French, but I think that's 100% right.
Thank you.
But the award is given to an author whose, quote, fame does not yet match his talent.
Ah.
Which is really beautiful. So this was in the category for books that are translated into French. Charles Yu is married. He has 2 kids. And I think his character, Willis Wu, we'll talk about. You kind of see a lot of similarities between Willis Wu, the character, and Charles Yu, the author, especially becoming a father, life in the world of TV. So yeah, that's a little bit about Charles Yu. He has a fun interview with Trevor Noah on The Daily Show.
Oh.
When he was promoting this book. We'll link that in the show notes.
Wait, older brother went to law school.
Is Willis Wu Kelvin?
Yeah, is Willis Wu Kelvin?
Maybe it's not 1-to-1. You know, maybe Willis Wu and older brother are parts of himself.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe he split his personality in half.
Willis Wu is the version of him that's stuck with writing, you know, from the get-go.
Yeah.
And working in TV.
And was like determined to make it.
Yeah, whereas older brother is the part of him that went to law school and pursued that career for a dozen years.
Interesting.
A baker's dozen, 13.
A baker's dozen.
So yes, I've gone on about Charles Yu. We've mentioned Willis Wu, but tell us about what this book's about.
Yeah, we keep mentioning Willis Wu. Willis Wu is the main character of Interior Chinatown. So I'm going to attempt to explain this book, but there's going to be a lot of question marks in my summary in the way I wrote it, because we're going to get to these questions in the discussion because I still don't quite know the answer. So this is a book told in second person, roughly from the perspective of Willis Wu, a man who lives on a film set in a TV show? Or he's an actor in a TV show that films where he lives, but he's also the whole book is written in screenplay format, as we talked about, but then sometimes Willis Wu sort of has the power to move between novel dialogue and screenplay dialogue, and so he can kind of move in and out of the format, and so it's kind of difficult to figure out what the parameters and the reality of this world is. Where is boots on the ground? Where are we? It's a little hard to tell. But the show is called Black and White, and it's a blatant Law and Order SVU reference. Very, very clearly, like, just an exact ripoff, like the way it's written, the description of the show, the dialogue, who the characters are, etc. And it's set, this episode that they're filming is set in Chinatown, which is where Willis Wu lives, where he and his family and other people, either who immigrated from parts of East Asia or who are of Asian descent, are sort of forced to exist in the background as like background characters, like exotic Asian woman or mid-level gangster, or the one that Willis Wu always plays is generic Asian man, number 3 or number 2 or number 1, or dead guy. And so his goal when we first meet him is he's like trying to work up to becoming Kung Fu Man. So essentially he's trying to work up to becoming Bruce Lee. And that's the other thing that's confusing. Like, he's aware of other films that exist in the world, but he's also in a film. I don't know. Anyway, he's trying to become Bruce Lee because that's like the pinnacle of what generic Asian man background characters can become. That's how they know they've made it, sort of. And so he falls in love, and he encounters different groups of people who are also sort of, he realizes how many people are kind of trapped in their different roles in this TV show. So in the end, there's like this big courtroom scene, like the end of an episode of Law and Order, and he realizes that the only way he can be truly free is to reject the format altogether. The show leaves Chinatown, and they just kind of live their lives. So that's the story.
This podcast is made possible by our fantastic book club members. You can support the show by becoming a member on buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. Starting at $3 per month, book club members can connect with fellow listeners, help us select books for future episodes, unlock exclusive posts and messages, get early and discounted access to future events, and more. And if you want to take your support to the next level, you can join the TISM tier, which starts at $5 per month. The TISM tier is all about autism. Are you an autistic person looking for community? A possible neurodiverse person looking for resources? Or an ally hoping to learn more from an actually autistic person? Members of this tier get free access to Julia's autism-related articles on Medium. The best part of any book club, besides the books, is the community. So join us in our growing community of book nerds by becoming a member of the book club today. Follow the link in our show notes or go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv to join the party. That's buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. We'll see you there. We both discussed beforehand, though, like, we have so many questions. So we thought it'd be kind of fun, in honor of this kind of fake Law and Order episode, to play detectives ourselves, to figure out who, how, why, what is happening in this book.
Yeah, we're on the case. We're gonna figure out who done it.
Insert detective music here. Just kidding. I don't know what detective music is. So yeah, like Pink Panther theme song?
No, we what's the Law and Order sound?
Bum bum.
Bum bum. So normally in an investigation you would start with who, but I think the more interesting question and the more helpful question to get us started is actually how.
Depending on the murder you know, you might be wondering how they died the entire time.
Right, that's true. This is one where we got to figure out the method first. Like, how the hell does this show work? What are the rules? Because at some point there's like a show within a show within a show, but they can move in and out of it. How much control do they have? It's very hard to tell.
Kind of like Willy Wonka. You know, like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And you go inside a factory, and then there's like an entire world inside, and then there's like a world inside that world, and then in the book they get in an elevator and they just get blasted into space, and you're like, I don't know what's happening. So I would say this is not a children's book by any means, but it gave me some strong Willy Wonka vibes.
Well, because at first it starts talking about the character of Willis and how he really wants to be Kung Fu Man, but he's stuck being like generic Asian man number 3. And his sort of, it has his like cast, like all the roles he's played, you know? So his like his acting resume. And so at first you're kind of like, oh, is this like a literal story of an actor, like in our world, told in screenplay format to like, for emphasis, right? And then the more you get into it, you're like, no, I think he like lives on set.
Yeah, he like goes upstairs and he's home.
Yeah, and then at certain points it seems like none of them have real jobs. Like the roles that they do in the town are just for the sake of the show, but the town also operates somehow.
Yeah, and they talk about like when everyone's gone from the restaurant, you know, like everyone kicking back and doing karaoke and like hanging out, and he has conversations and stories and life events that happen with his neighbors in their apartment building that don't happen, quote unquote, on set.
Or maybe on screen is the better way to say it. They don't have it on screen. And his dad and his mom have whole backstories of like their family history and their immigration story and how they ended up in this Chinatown. But they're also told as film reels, right? So his dad's story is like, it literally calls it like a period piece or a historical drama. Then when he runs away, he gets married to this woman named Karen. They have a child, and she grows like 4 years in a year or something. And then the wife their whole family gets cast in like a kids show. And so when Willis becomes Kung Fu Man and he thinks he has everything he wants and he realizes he hates it, he runs away. But when he runs away to another TV show, and he walks into it, and it's a kids show. So the rules of the world, there's like disembodied children singing at all times of the day, and he's like, what is happening right now? Why are they singing? Why are they counting in Chinese? Like, the way his daughter talks is they kind of learn lessons, but then she goes and hides in her closet and is like telling her she's kind of losing her mind, and she's like got the whole outline for the show on her walls of like what's gonna happen, and it's kind of terrifying. Anyway, I'm getting really off track, but there's so many layers of film and TV-ness, you know, that it's really hard to tell. Like, they're aware that they're in a show. It's written as a screenplay, so everything that happens is in the screenplay, is in the show that we, the audience, are watching. But then the characters within it are aware that they're in the show and go in and out of set. I
think there's a few things here. One, it's like, should we think this hard about it? Or is it one of those, like,
probably not.
Don't think too hard, just take it for what it is. That's one thing. Another is that I think the kind of extended metaphor that we'll kind of get into more when we talk about motive is, like, the role you play. And so I found it really fascinating that when Willis Wu's wife and daughter move away and he goes to visit, the show's all about the daughter. So in some ways, she is getting this whole new experience where she's not a background character, she's like the center of it all. And that's kind of symbolic of like a child's experience, especially where you are developmentally at that age, that like the world revolves around you. So when he comes, he can be a part of her show, but it's still all about her. And I think, there's like this little line you could follow if you want to think specifically of Willis Wu as a father, of like he has to find himself outside of being a father, but he also needs to be present as a father, and like kind of straddling that line of like, the show is all about my daughter, but like there's a life for me and there's things I need to figure out for myself outside of this like kid's world, which then also makes my like heart break for Karen, because she seems to be just stuck in that. She didn't have a choice to not be there, to be a part of Phoebe's life. Phoebe's the daughter. So that's just one read, I think, of what's happening with the children's show aspect. Yeah, there's a lot happening, though.
There's a lot. I mean, there's some really amazing social commentary that happens when he plays around with the form. Mm-hmm. So, like, the very, Willis, his internal dialogue exists in, like, an interior margin at the very, very beginning of the book. Like, literally in the margins. You know what I mean? It's like you exist in the margins, and then the text is literally in the margin of the book. And it's, like, right justified, so it's, like, deep in the book, and you have to, like, really peel it open to read it. And then he gets fed up with the show, and he decides to step in and give himself dialogue. And so the formatting reflects that decision. It moves from the margins into, it literally says into frame, and the placement of the text shifts into the screenplay formatting. And so he sort of puts himself into the narrative, and then he starts speaking in dialogue with the other actors, and they're like really confused, but their lines are in dialogue. And then he starts helping out with this investigation in Chinatown, and he goes to talk to his dad. But when he speaks Taiwanese with his dad, it moves out of scripted screenplay dialogue into novel-style prose. So it's like suddenly it's in quotation marks, and it has regular indentation, and it like changes depending on who he's talking to, and so he's able to move in and out of the show, but the show is also still happening at the same time, still, because we're watching it. That's the part that's confusing, is like he knows he's in a TV show, he can move in and out of it, but he's still trapped in it at the same time.
Yeah, so there's kind of this element of like an alternate reality, like you mentioned, living inside of a TV show, inside of a movie. At the same time, layered over that, we have this extended metaphor that this movie means something and stands in for something that is in our actual reality as the reader. And we can kind of read it at multiple levels then. I do think the constant moving back and forth in and out can get a little discombobulating.
Yeah.
But I think adds to like the overall effect of the book, that it isn't super explicit, telling you what's happening the whole time. In the same way that we critique the monologue for being very straightforward and telling you what this book is about. If it was all script all the time or all prose all the time. Yeah, I don't know. I find it fascinating, like his playing with form as well. There was in an interview he joked when someone asked, why'd you write it like as a screenplay? And he joked, I already had the software, it was just easier. Because he writes for TV. That's funny too, but I thought it was interesting that he, as a writer, was blending these two things that he's really familiar with, writing prose fiction and writing screenplays, and like finding a way that they could like live together and like amplify the story he's trying to tell.
Having a screenwriting software is very important, because trying to do it in Microsoft Word is extremely unnatural. The indentation and the margins are bonkers. You really got to have separate screenwriting software, so I can see that being a thing. But it led to something very cool.
So ultimately, we don't really know how the show is working, but we know it is working. It's doing something.
Yeah, okay. I guess where I would land with the how is like, yeah, I think it's ultimately meant to be an extended metaphor. I think the whole thing, there's like a show within a show. So like we're watching the book as a show, and then there's the show of black and white within the show that we're watching. So there's the show that's the story of Willis Wu's life, and then the show that he's choosing to be a part of is called Black and White. And that show, he can move in and out of it. It doesn't solve all the problems, but I think that's where I would land. But it's the show within the show that we're watching is the metaphor So it's not meant to be super realistic or to follow clear rules, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a good place to land there.
Man, that was really difficult.
I just felt like so much of like anthropologist Julia come out and you're like, so what are the rules for this society? How do we understand these people in the way that they interact with each other? Let's observe. And then you throw down the notebook and you're like, we have observed, we don't know. Field research is not going well.
Yeah. Yeah. The this for the whodunit of like who is the narrator. We before this I spent, how long did I spend? Like 20 minutes or so just flipping through the book, finding all the different examples of how the narrator talks. So you're not far from the mark there, I think. So who the heck is the narrator? Who's telling this story?
Yeah, we have a lot of changing tense, a lot of changing, but maybe not changing as far as who is doing the talking. Because like some elements of a script, we have things that are what we'll call stage direction tense. So that's when we use the plural we to refer to how the camera is framing something. So at the very top of a script, we might see something like, we see young Wu moving, in progress, making his way to the new world, bright-eyed, full of hope. So it's kind of giving like stage direction / kind of a mood for the scene that's about to unfold. And this is pretty common that we see in screenwriting, but maybe less common that we would see it in a novel form to so explicitly tell us what is happening and referring to the viewer as we. So we have that kind of like almost omniscient, very outside of it narrator, and then we go like everywhere in between. We've got like this first person plural going on. So first person plural is when we use we. So if I'm talking about Julie and I'll be like, we are recording a podcast.
So the two different we's are interesting because one implicates the viewer, and like you said, it gives the point of view of the camera, but it like includes the us. It like makes us the viewer of the action, and the other we is more the writer, the narrator, including himself in with his character of Willis. It's sort of looping them in together as like a collective of some kind. It's interesting because you're like, okay, who's writing this? Is like the screenwriter director of Black and White writing this? Or is this like some omniscient person who decides the fate of our lives? Or is this like the powerful people of America? Or is this Willis writing it about himself if he's referring to himself as we? That one's really tricky. It's interesting too that there's a version of a first person plural we that implicates the reader or the viewer, because normally second person would do that, right? That's why we don't put second person in like academic writing, because we don't want to be screaming at the reader like, you should do this. But this book is primarily written in second person, but it's not talking about the reader.
Yeah, so this one, I feel like I'm making up this term. If you teach grammar or English or anything and you know what this is called, let us know. DM us. I'm calling it the second person personal.
It's a Bruick original.
It's the Bruick TM. Second person personal. This tense is using the you, your, yours, but it's referring to the person speaking. I think I can read an example better than I can explain this. So this is like towards the beginning of the book. We get it multiple places. These days, he is mostly old Asian man, no longer Sifu, with the pants and the muscles and the look in his eye. All that is gone now. But when did it happen? Over years and overnight. The day you first noticed, you'd shown up a few minutes early for weekly lesson. Maybe that's what threw him off. When he answered the door, it took him a moment to recognize you. 2 seconds or 20, a frozen eternity then. As he regained himself, his familiar scowl barking your name, Willis Wu! Half exclamation, half confirmation, as if verifying for both you and himself that he hadn't forgotten. So in this section, we're referring to you, but Willis is telling a story about himself. He's remembering a specific incident, but instead of saying, the day I first noticed, I had shown up a few minutes early. He says the day you first noticed, you'd shown up. And so it's a really interesting choice, I think, because we sometimes use this colloquially in like our everyday conversations, and we'll use it like very small snippets. Like I wouldn't tell you a whole story about my own life and use this second person personal, as I'm calling it, but I might interject something like, but what would you do? You know, like if I was telling Julia this long story and I'm like, oh my gosh, and at the end I'm like, I don't know, what would you do? And I'm referring to myself or to Julia or to both of us. I don't know if that's a good example of second person personal.
The way I usually use it is when I say like, you know, when you're like doing this thing and suddenly you feel like this.
Yeah, that's a good
example. And I'm
example.
not talking about you. I'm talking about something that happened to me, but it's sort of including the person I'm telling in like a shared experience in a way, but I'm telling a story about myself.
Yeah. So we get that like to the extreme, because like in this example, we're getting a very specific story. Like I, as the reader, don't have an example of when I went into my kung fu teacher / father's house and he forgot who I was for a second. But I think by using that second person personal, the author is really not only speaking to his own experience through the eyes of Willis Wu in this extended metaphor, but inviting other readers who strongly relate, so primarily other Americans of Asian descent who might relate to those experiences. Like that's my read on it, is that it's like, I'm going to be super, like he's like super straightforward, that he's talking not just about his own experience, but a collective experience of many people through the eyes and experiences of one individual character. Like we don't have to sit around and be like, oh, does Willis Wu stand in for Asian men who feel generic? He's literally called Generic Asian Man, and uses that second person personal for anyone who relates to that experience to like immediately put themselves in that story.
But then he uses you in other ways as well. He has this kind of roaming consciousness, which we associate primarily with some of the greats like Jane Austen or Virginia Woolf. And it's a technique called free indirect discourse, where the writer is still staying in this kind of distant narration, but they move between different people's perspectives and gets really, really close to them and starts speaking the way that those different characters would speak. So sometimes he takes on the internal dialogue of Willis himself, where Willis is like freaking out and he's like, you don't know the rules. What should you do? What should you be doing right now? You know, and kind of Willis's internal dialogue. He uses it to become the film executives and crew. So he says, yes, your kung fu is perfect, immaculate, pristine, platonically ideal kung fu from the highest plane of martial arts. But, and we hate to ask this, can you still do the accent? So he's not putting that in quotes. This is part of the narration, but he's affecting his voice as if it's from the perspective of the people who are creating this show. And then he does another one where it's sort of from the perspective of the show creators, but also like the general perceived audience of the show of Black and White, where... And there's just something about Asians, their faces, their skin color, it just automatically takes you out of this reality, forces you to step back and say, whoa, what is this? What kind of world are we in? And what are these Asians doing in my cop show? Again, it's narration, but it's someone else talking who is not the narrator, and the narrator's just putting on their voice for a second. So that's free indirect discourse. And he does that quite a bit too. So he sort of moves in between really close to Willis's perspective, and then also to like the behind the scenes crew of like the
Mm-hmm.
writers and directors and producers and the audience, of the people who are watching this and making it, which is, again, makes it even more confusing because you're like, where are the borders of this reality? And who is telling me this story? Is it Willis telling me the story? Is it the showrunners telling me the story? Is it someone from an alternate reality putting, like, it's a god, like an omniscient narrator kind of thing? Is he in the show? Is he outside of the show? I don't know, Victoria.
Yeah. I would say if you made it through this section and you're like, I don't understand these tenses, that's fine.
Yeah.
We just like geeking out. So we talked about those, like, as a recap, the stage direction tense, first person plural that has the use of we, the second person personal using the tense of you, but to speak to the individual, and then free indirect discourse, which takes on the character voice of someone else without putting it in quotes, and it might use any variation of pronouns, a multi-pronoun approach. But all this to say, if you were confused reading this, where we were at, who was speaking, you're not alone. Even in defining all these tenses, a lot of books might use 1 or 2, and he's used at least 4, if not more, that we've identified here. And I think this kind of, if I were to make like an argument of like what he's doing by using all these tenses, I think he's helping the reader get into multiple perspectives. So if you resonate with Willis Wu, you can easily put yourself into that character role. Or if you don't personally identify, you can more easily put yourself in that position to understand. You can see it from the outside, you can see it from the inside. And to recognize that, like, in this metaphor, it's not like it's like a very wibbly wobbly metaphor to kind of like see it in almost like a 3D or 4D scape. Instead of just watching a film, you're like on a 2-dimensional TV, you're like in it, above it, around it, while perhaps confusing at times. I think it might be intentionally so, to kind of just flip you around all the different points of view that's happening here.
So maybe the narrator is just the author, but he takes on all these different voices, uses all these different pronouns, so that whoever's reading it can put themselves in their role, right? So, like, you and I are not Asian men, so we would never be cast as generic Asian man number 3. We would either be the, like, white audience members setting certain requirements on who should be the leads of our TV show, or we would be the white woman cop.
Oh, white female cop. Yeah, she gets a name eventually, but I don't remember what it is.
So, like, we could put ourselves wherever, you know what I mean? Like, wherever we come from.
Yeah, and then also stand in those other shoes, too. I think, ultimately, while I will never understand fully the lived experience of Asian men in America, Charles Yu's writing can help give me the perspective of Willis Wu to be sympathetic, understanding, outraged, or any sort of emotions that he's trying to elicit from non-Asian readers, but maybe create a sense of understanding or solidarity or coming together for Asian readers. I feel like every time we get to the end of a section, I'm like, here's what we're saying. Also, question marks. Question mark, question mark, question mark. Is that what we're saying?
All of the questions, I still have all the same questions, but I think I just pick a preference, like getting an English degree trained me to just like pick a lane that I like the best and just stick with it. I'm like, all right, this is what I'm going to argue.
Yeah, and then you can read someone else's essay and you'd be like, yeah, I see that too.
Yeah. Okay. We get down to the motive of why was this written? What is the argument that Charles Yu is trying to make? Like, if he's our narrator here, what is he trying to tell us as the audience members, as the viewers of this show, and potentially actors in the show? Question mark. Yeah, what is he trying to say? Like, what is the metaphor? Because we kept referring to this extended metaphor, but what is the metaphor referring to? Is it just a critique of Hollywood? Or is it of America as a whole? Or is he trying to do both and maybe juggling too many things?
Yeah, initially my thought was like, oh, like this book is about Asian representation in Hollywood. But that's very surface level, and that's almost as if I only read the back cover and didn't read the book itself. I do think it's more largely critiquing America as a whole, especially if we kind of, going back to the earlier discussion about parenting and the role that he plays in Phoebe's child TV show. Willis Wu is also a character that kind of brings us in to understand what it means to play a role and play the role that you've been assigned. Because while he's trying to work up this ladder to make it to that kung fu master role, there is a prescribed ladder, and there's only certain roles he can fill, and the only one that has fame or pays well or any sort of consistency are these very stereotyped roles that are very limited, and it pits other Asian actors against each other because there's only one person who can do that role. And I think kind of to follow it all the way to the end when he kind of just leaves, I think it's kind of saying, not that all Asian American actors should just leave the industry. I don't think at all that's what he's saying. I think it's more like you should leave that prescribed set of rules, and perhaps to go a little further, maybe this is extending beyond what he's actually saying in the book, is to like go chart your own path. Like if the roles don't exist, whether it's actually in Hollywood or the roles in just generally your life that you want to live, go make them. Go like live your life as yourself instead of the role that's been prescribed to you. But not in like a super self-help, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of way, because he does in that courtroom monologue scene go through all the reasons why our culture and societal structures in America are built in that way, and like the history of oppression against people of Asian descent in our country that has led to the situation that these characters find themselves in, as far as being like pigeonholed and stereotyped into a very few amount of roles available.
Yeah, I kind of go back and forth, but I think the line that ultimately sets me down somewhere, there's this line where it's talking about his parents immigrating from Taiwan and why they did it. And he has this phrase where he says, like, his parents wanted him, their child, to become part of the American show, in quotes. And so, to me, like, they moved from one TV show to another. And so, to me, that sort of sets me down, and I'm like, okay, this is an extended metaphor for the structure of America as a whole, and what are kind of the assigned societal roles that we all have, and who are the stars versus who gets pushed into the margins. Like, there's a character, an unnamed character, I think she's just called Attractive Officer, who appears twice, and it's a Black woman, and she has like one line in like the crime scene, and Willis talks to her at another point, like offset in like craft services or something, while he's dead and waiting to be put back on the show. She talks about how she's never given a lead role either, and she's largely ignored, and she has her own thing, right? I think ultimately my reading is more broad, and it's like this TV show is a metaphor for how American culture works. You know, it's sort of a reflection of, it's a satirical reflection of our own culture rather than just a critique of media representation.
Mm-hmm.
Though it does obviously comment on that.
Yeah, so like the roles people play literally on TV and the roles that people play in society and in their communities.
That's where I would land. That one's a little bit easier.
Yeah, we may not know how it's working, who is speaking, but we kind of know why they're writing, like why you wrote this and what the argument ultimately is.
So do we have a verdict?
Yes, in honor of the game Clue, it was Charles Yu, the author, ? In the extended metaphor ? With the argument that Asian Americans are Americans and don't have to fit a prescribed role.
Excellent. Perfect formatting.
Thank you. Clue was a childhood favorite of mine, even though playing it as a adult, I'm like, this is a ridiculous game. I do not like it anymore. That's besides the point. So anyways, any other wrap-up thoughts?
I think ultimately, like, yes, it won the National Book Award, but part of me is like, this is a very niche book that I think the thing it does best is satirize media and only secondarily critiques the United States, because that metaphor is a little harder to pin down because of the way it's written. And I think you can get a little bit lost in all the questions that we had, right? Of who's talking to me? How does this story work? Is this real? Is this a real TV show? Is he really in it? Is like a Truman Show situation? Like, how does this work? You know, there's a long courtroom monologue where he like explains the history of immigration law in the US. Like, you know, it's very, I don't know if it's as accessible and universal as maybe the National Book Award the people who gave him the National Book Award would claim it to be. So I think there's a reason we had all these questions, and it's not like we're dumb or something. You know what I mean? It's like the way it's written is a bit obscure on purpose, I think. It's really funny and clever and thought-provoking, but it also is kind of convoluted. And so, like, even though we sort of landed somewhere, I think I don't know if I would say that it's not a perfect book. I don't know if I would have given it the National Book Award. I would definitely recommend that people read it. Absolutely. I don't know if I would have given it the National Book Award.
Many thanks again to our book club member Claire for recommending this.
Yes.
Proved very interesting and a lot of fodder for discussion.
And outside of something that I think we would have just picked up ourselves.
Yeah. Especially
because what we're always looking for.
I just don't pay attention to the newest books.
Yeah, we're almost never with the times. We read books so many years late. It's
like, have you heard of this great book from 2007? All right. So for people who enjoyed reading this or found it very fascinating and want to read more, what would you recommend they check out next?
So I don't own a ton of satire, but if you loved this book, particularly for the film references and I guess the satire and kind of the making fun of how films are made, I would highly recommend this very obscure and bizarre book that I'm obsessed with called Ayoade on Top by Richard Ayoade. It's a British comedian. He's basically, his whole thing is that he's extremely awkward and nerdy. And I think he's autistic, but, you know, it's fine. And he breaks down shot by shot this like really, really poorly made Gwyneth Paltrow rom-com about her becoming a flight attendant. Just really, really cutting sarcasm. But he basically is singing the very exaggerated praises of this film in order to point out how stupid it is and sort of critique film in general. It's amazing. And then this book also kind of reminded me of the TV show Community, where the character of Abed, also canonically autistic, I would like to point out, shows you who I care about. The character of Abed is aware that they're in a TV show, and he makes all these references to the multiverse, and he makes all these references to how the film is made, and he's like, oh, you gotta keep talking, it's for your monologue, but no one else gets it. And it made me think of that, and it provides space for a lot of social commentary as well. So yeah, those two things.
I'm having a hard time thinking of what else to recommend because this feels very unique to the kinds of books that I read. But if you haven't seen The Truman Show, go watch that just for the cultural reference point. It's like the famous Jim Carrey movie where the premise is that he is raised inside of a TV show, but he does not know he's in a TV show.
Yeah, big difference.
Yes. There are other books out there by Charles Yu that you could check out. How to Live Safely in a Science Fiction Universe is his other novel about a time machine repairman. It seems pretty...
Sounds similar.
Yeah, like paradoxical, difficult to wrap your brain around the time and space where you're at. And then Sorry, Please, Thank You is his short story collection, one of the two that he released. So you can check out his other books as well. So what are things that are bringing you joy currently? What are you obsessed with?
Since I'm going to be moving to Belgium, I've been back on that Duolingo. That I've invited the owl back into my life, and I've been studying Dutch and French, which are the two languages of Belgium. Dutch is just the most ridiculous language, and I apologize to any Dutch listeners, but it's so funny. So I have a little chuckle to myself, and I've been watching some TV shows, and I try to watch TV shows set in Belgium so that they speak a little bit of both languages. And then Bleachers has a new album, Jack Antonoff's project. They have a new album, and it has a long title that I don't remember the name, but they basically made like a Bruce Springsteen album, but like in their own Bleachers style. And Bruce Springsteen's even on one of the songs, but it has like strings and it's very acoustic sounding, and his vocals are kind of, the mix is kind of funny. It sounds like an old school mix. It's hard to describe, but it just sounds old because of like they recorded it all in one room or something. And I've been really loving that.
I'm currently obsessed with my roommate's cat. I want to keep her forever. Vern and I were actually talking this morning over breakfast of like, are we cat people now? Do we get a cat? I think we need a road cat whenever we travel. Just a cat that's happy to come along. Start talking through logistics. We'll see if that happens, but yeah. I never had cats growing up. I always wanted a cat. All I had was a stuffed animal of a cat that I would pet and pretend was real. Quite sad, actually. But I'm obsessed with Fuku. She's very sociable. She'll like come sit on your lap all the time. And yeah, we have moved to a new neighborhood in Chicago, so I've just been really enjoying things that I did at my old neighborhood, going for long walks, but now it's, change of scenery. We're closer to the lake. So that's been really joyful. I've been to the lake like every other day this week.
Wow.
Compared to our old neighborhood where I'd go like 2 times a summer because
it
was just far enough to be highly inconvenient to my daily life.
It was like a once or twice a year activity.
Yeah. Or like someone's in town, let's go meet up there. Or yeah. So that's what's going on with me. Sounds
nice. Cats and the lake.
Can't get better than this.
A dream.
Yes.
No. All right. Well.
Until next time.
Farewell.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Book Club with Julia and Victoria. Chime in with your own thoughts and recommendations on Instagram at bookclubwithjv or through the contact form on our website, www.bookclubwithjv.com. Our website is also where you can find show notes for this episode, which include links to any of the recommendations we gave or other tidbits we mentioned. Make sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're currently listening, and leave us a 5-star review on Apple while you're there. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick. Our logo was designed by Gabby Febland, and Rebecca Gesney is our project manager. We'll catch you all on our next episode. Happy reading!